Okay? Bakit nalang sir natin gamitin ay D1 at saka D2? Distance 1 and distance 2. Okay? Because the answer is sometime in history, it was observed that when we use epsilon and delta in mathematics, they represent small distances. Okay? Kasi natakot ka agad kay epsilon delta. Huwag kayo matakot kay epsilon and delta. Epsilon and delta are just distances. Okay? Kung gaano kalayo ang bayan ninyo dun sa next town, siyempre medyo malayo yun in terms of kilometers. But then when we talk of limits, kailangan kasi natin ay small distances. And classically in mathematics, sometime in the history of mathematics, they use epsilon and delta to denote small distances. Okay? So again, wag matakot kay epsilon sa delta. Sabi kasi nung kanina, scary, nakakatakot naman yan. Ano yung mga yan? Epsilon and delta are just small distances. How small? Relatively small. Mahirap kasing sabihin sa math ang small, right? What do we mean by small? How small is small? How close is close? How near is near? How far is far? Tama ba? Pag sabi nyo kasing x equal to 1, let's say sabihin mo ang distance ay 1. Ang vague niya, di ba? Pag sabi mo bang ang distance ay 1, malapit na ba yon? Distance ko ay 1. Ang distance ko mula sa kanya ay 1. Malapit ba yon? Ano masabi ninyo? Ang distance ko sa isang tao ay 1. Malapit na ba yon? Ang problem kasi natin, of course, you can change that depending on the unit that you are going to use. Tama, di ba? Paano pag 1 kilometer pala yon? Malayo yon. Pero paano pag 1 centimeter? Medyo naman, pero as compared to 1 millimeter, mas maliit yon. That is one problem when we talk of closeness approaches. When we talk of being close, being near, relative with the unit. Pwede nyo sabihin ang 0.1 ay malapit, but then paano pag siya pala ay 0.1 kilometer? Malayo pa rin yun, di ba? 1 meter pa nga ba yun? Or parang 10 meters pa yata. So ganun yung mga problem natin when we are using this word closeness. So that's why in mathematics, we are not really saying a precise word that this is small or this is large. Look at that. Epsilon is an arbitrarily small distance. We are not really saying how small. We are just saying a relative observation of what we mean by closeness. Okay? So when we say small, hindi po tayo precise. Hindi sinasabi na pag sinabi nating less than 1, small na yon, or probably greater than 1, malaki na yon. We are not saying that. These are again arbitrarily close. Okay? So epsilon here are arbitrarily small distances. Okay? And delta will be the corresponding distance of the excess from A. So again, wag matakot kay epsilon and delta. We are just using epsilon and delta to refer to distances. Specifically, epsilon is the distance of the function values from L, and delta will be the corresponding distance of x from A. Let me show you. Okay. This is our graph of our function, this green one. We want to say the limit of the function as x approaches A is L. Ano raw si epsilon? Epsilon represents the distance of the function values from L. L here is our desired limit, and A here is the value that x approaches to. Epsilon represents distances of the function values from L. So when you say epsilon, ito lamang, distance from L. If you are wondering why I'm using parentheses here, because we want to cap that distance. Let's go back. Ang gusto kasi, ba't ayaw mag-back ng slide ko? Ayan. Okay. Gusto kasi nating lagyan ng some sort of a boundary or some upper bound yung distance natin. And this is the case of epsilon. Epsilon here represents the maximum distance from our desired limit L. That's why in this illustration, these parentheses represent the desired function values that we need as around L. That's why napapansin nyo, epsilon going above and epsilon going below, because this represents the distances of the function values from L. Okay? In this case, linear distance lang po siya, di ba? Napansin nyo naman na vertical lang naman yung line natin. So when we say up to some point here, ang distance natin from L will be epsilon. At some point here, ang distance din natin from the limit L is also epsilon. Okay? Wait. I think I can... Siguro, akin lang i-annotate para makita natin. Wait, let me just change the color. What I mean is, sa part na to, kumbaga, sorry, nagkakaroon ng problem yung tablet ko today. I don't know why. Ito yung ating desired limit. Dito. Sorry. And then ito yung ating epsilon distance. Sorry. So kapag kumuha kayo rito ng mga values, I don't know what's the problem with my tablet today, but then pag kumuha kayo ng mga values dito, mapapansin natin, ang distance ng mga values natin dito from L will be less than epsilon. Dahil kasi up to here, the distance will be epsilon. And also going above, up to this point, okay, ang distance natin from L will be epsilon. Okay, so this epsilon provide us a boundary of the distances from L. Okay, let me just clear that. I just messed up the slide. Okay, so this epsilon here provides the maximum desired distance from this limit L. Okay, and in the same case, for the case of the values of x, we want the values of x to be sufficiently close to A. In this case, we want the distance delta. So kumbaga, you can probably put a boundary there. Yan. So all these x's here to the right and to the left of A will represent a distance of utmost delta from A. So epsilon represents a distance, the maximal distance from the limit L, and then delta represents here a maximal distance from A, the maximal distance of x from this value A. Okay? So balik tayo. Okay? So again, epsilon and delta classically in mathematics are used to denote distances. Specifically for this one, epsilon represents the small distance of f of x from L, as you can see here again. Ba't ayaw? Okay, as you can see from here again. This epsilon denotes the distances of the function values from L, and then yun namang delta denotes the distances of x from A. Bakit nagkaka-problem ako? Okay, this one. As you can see from here. Okay? So if we want to say that the limit of the function as x approaches A is L, ang gusto nating mangyari, dapat yung mga x's natin, yung mga function values natin will be around here within a maximum epsilon distance. Okay? Naroon lang dapat yung mga function values natin. Okay? Yan. At dapat, correspondingly, yung mga x's natin should be around here. Kumbaga, if I will put an x value here, the corresponding function value will be somewhere around here. Okay? So again, before we continue, epsilon and delta just represent distances. Epsilon, the distance of the function values from L, delta, the maximal of the values of x from A. Continue natin. Wait. Nasaan yun? Okay. Okay. So punta na tayo roon. Doon sa nakita nyo kanina nakakatakot. So ang gusto natin gawin ngayon from this arbitrary closeness and sufficient closeness, we want to use epsilon and delta to denote the distances. We want the epsilon to be arbitrarily small, and correspondingly, we are going to get delta. So how do you read this? Or how do you interpret this? We want the distances of the function values to be at most epsilon distance from the limit L. And correspondingly, the x's should be at most delta distance from our value A. Going back, ito po uli yun. Gusto nating mangyari, yung mga function values natin will just be around this, within epsilon distance. Correspondingly, the x's will be within delta distance from A. Okay? So we want to choose epsilon, arbitrarily small. Then we can find an appropriate delta that will represent the distance from A. Okay? So before we continue, okay po ba yung ating, nakuha ba natin kung ano yung essence ni epsilon at saka ni delta? They are just distances, relatively small distances. Nakuha po ba natin? Okay. So I hope napukuha niyo agad sa picture kung ano nare-represent ni epsilon at saka ni delta. Kasi dito napupunta yung mga nakita natin kaninang may mga absolute values. So the question is, bakit nga ba meron tayong mga absolute values? Okay? So, diretso tayo. Okay. It's because of this. Epsilon, arbitrarily small, correspondingly should be a delta. And what is the requirement? This is the requirement. The requirement is if x is within a distance delta from A, again, yung delta po ay nagre-represent lamang ng distance ng x from A, then f of x is within a distance epsilon from L. Okay? Magkakalimutan, delta represents the maximal distance of x from A. So that's why written here, if x is within a distance delta from A, then the corresponding function value is within a distance epsilon from L. And let me continue with that. Ito po yon. Kumbaga, yung x's daw natin is, if the x's are somewhere here, then the corresponding function value, sorry, I'm moving things on my desktop, should be within here. Specifically, if I choose an x here, the corresponding function value should be within here. And you can do that for other points. Kumbaga, you can choose more. Kuha pa tayo siguro na isa pa. Just to show you. You can choose one more x here. Yeah. And if you're going to look at the corresponding function value, you traced it. And the corresponding function value, sorry for the lines, will also be within this. Crooked po yung line ko, ha. So maybe somewhere here, i-trace nyo lamang siya. And then the corresponding function value, notice, will be around here. So yun yung gusto nating mangyari. For every epsilon, we want to get a delta such that if the excess is within here, then the corresponding function values will be within this. Okay? Diretso natin. So I hope you can see it from that illustration. Kung ano yung ginagawa ng delta, ng epsilon at saka ni delta. Epsilon bounds the function values from L. And then yung delta natin, siya naman yung nagbabound yung mga excess natin from A. Such that if x is within here, then the corresponding function value should be around here. Okay? Yan. If x is within a distance delta from A, f of x is within a distance epsilon from L. Okay, so sagutin na natin, bakit bigla nagkaroon ng absolute value? Okay, bakit nagkaroon bigla ng mga absolute value dun sa epsilon delta definition? It's because of distances. Tanda ba natin pag sinabi nating distance along a line? I did not prepare a slide for that one, but then you just imagine sa x-axis. If I give you 2 points, let's say, wait, let me just change my pen. Okay, kasi naglagay ako dito ng isang value, sabihin ko x1. That's my problem. Ayaw gumana ng tablet ko. Okay, so let's say x1 yon. Kumuha ko ng isa pang value rito, x2. Okay. What is the distance between x1 and x2? Anyone? Along the x-axis, I chose 2 values of x, x1 and x2. What is the distance between x1 and x2? Anyone? Or medyo ba masyadong general? Gawin natin specific. Okay, sige, erase ko lang. Erase ko muna lahat ng marks dyan. Kuha tayo ng specific value. Let's say dito ay x equal to, probably sabihin natin 1. Okay? And kuha tayo isa dito, x equal to 5. Yan. Okay, ko lang specific para doon sa mga, may naglagay na sa chat, but then ito muna siya. Let's say I chose x equal to 1 and x equal to 5. What is the distance between 1 and 5? Sabihin natin, ang distance lamang will be, yan na may nagsabi na, 5 minus 1. So, ang distance nila ay 4. So, yung distance between this 5 and 1 is in fact 4. Okay? But then, let me just clear again the slide. But then, yung binigay ko sa inyo kanina, may nagsagot na pala. Pag kinuha ko rito yung x1 at kinuha ko rito yung x2, okay? Pag kinuha ko yung distance between x1 and x2, that is just x2 minus x1. x2 minus x1. Okay? In distance from here to here. Okay? But then you might be asking now, may isa naglagay naman si Sir Samuel. So thank you, Shadrin Ray. And then si Sir Samuel, may absolute value. Bakit nagkaroon ng absolute value? Because it takes care of the non-commutativity of subtraction. Like kasi diba, pag x2 minus x1 walang problem dahil kasi x2 is greater than x1. Pero paano pag nagbaliktad? Let's say narito si x2. x2, let's say, is not here. Okay? Narito si x2. What will be the distance now? So sabihin naman natin, dapat right minus left. Ang distance ay x1 minus x2. But then to avoid the hassle of looking at the ordering of x1 and x2, which one is on the right is on the left, the best way is just to represent them in terms of, ayan na, erase ko na uli ha, sorry. Rather than using x1 minus x2, x2 minus x1, para hindi nyo na problem kung ano yung mas malaki or yung mas maliit, the best way is to simply use absolute value of x2 minus x1. Okay? Yan. It takes care of the problem. Hindi na mahalaga kung sino ang nasa kanan o nasa kaliwa. That absolute value of x2 minus x1 denotes the distance between x2 and x1. It won't matter kung sino yung nasa kanan o nasa kaliwa. That absolute value takes care of the possible negativity. Sign kasi denotes the sign denotes direction. Pwede nyo pa nga sabihin siya ay, anong tawag nga natin dito? Directed distance. Okay, di ba ganon? Meron tayong directed distance. But then this is not directed distance. This is just absolute distances. Okay, and then when we talk of distances, they are always non-negative. Okay, so the absolute value takes care of that. Okay, so again, anong sense ng absolute value? The absolute value simply represents the distance. So that's why, moving forward, okay, ito na siya. Okay, na lumabas-basa. Yeah, okay. So how do we mathematically represent x is within a distance of delta from A? Let me just remove this. X is within a distance delta from A. We represent it in this way. Absolute value of x minus A less than delta, okay, means that the distance of x from A is at most delta. Or that x is within a distance of delta from A. So this absolute value represents the distance, specifically the distance of x from A. And when we read this, we mean that the distance of x from A is less than delta. And then from this one, f of x is within a distance epsilon from L, we mean that the distance of f of x, absolute value of f of x minus L, we mean that the distance of f of x from L is less than epsilon. Okay? So kaya nagkaroon doon ng absolute value because on a line, the distance is measured in terms of that absolute value. Hindi ko pala napakita yung sa f of x minus L. Let me go back. Ito po yun. Pag kinuha nyo kasi, ayun, dapat pala di ko na siya inalis. Yeah. Pag kinuha nyo naman kasi yung distance, let me just change my pen. Ito namang distance na to, yan. Yung vertical distance niya, they are both in the y-axis. If you're going to get the distance of f of x from L, yun yung f of x. Okay. Sorry for that. Ayaw gumana ng tablet ko ngayon. I'm not sure. Sinet up ko. Okay, yan. Yan. Absolute value of f of x minus L, this part represents the distance of f of x from L. And we want that distance to be less than epsilon. Okay? So, that's why, yan na. Lumabas na si epsilon at saka si delta. Okay? Epsilon and delta represent distances. Specifically, epsilon bounds the distance of the function values from L, and correspondingly, delta represents the distance of x from A. So rather than talking in terms of distance, ito na yung kanyang, sabi ko na pala, napakita ko na sa inyo kanina. Yan. Sorry, naglilo ko yung, mali yata yung nakiklik ko. Ay, tanggalin ko lang muna yung pen. Okay, yeah. Yan. Yan. The distance of x from A less than delta, the distance of f of x from L less than epsilon. And kung bakit siya naging ganito. How from if x is within delta distance from A, f of x within epsilon distance from A, naging siyang ito. Okay? Absolute value of x minus A, that is the distance less than delta. And then ito naman, absolute value of f of x minus L less than epsilon, the distance of f of x from L. Okay? Pero may problema kayo. May napansin kayo dito, biglang may isa akong bagay na idinagdag. May napansin ba kayo dito? Sabi lang kasi natin, previous slide. Diyan sa previous slide natin, the distance of x from A is at most delta. The distance of f of x from L is less than epsilon. Pero pagpunta nyo dito, may napansin kayo sa naka-yellow na highlight, may bigla akong idinagdag dyan. Anyone, may napansin bang bigla may sumulpot na lamang? Kumbaga, balik ulit tayo. Ayan, thank you. Napansin ni Mark. Ito yung nangyari kanina. Ito kasing x is within delta distance from A. Ito po siya. The distance of x from A is less than delta. Ito naman, the distance of f of x from L is less than epsilon. Tapos nung sinunod na natin, biglang may sumulpot bigla. Yeah, less than 0 ba? Yeah, absolute value of x minus A greater than 0 or yung 0 is less than this. So tingin ko napansin naman ng madami. I'm referring to this part. Ito. Bakit biglang sumulpot siya doon? Wala naman tayong sinasabi na dapat yung greater distance natin ay greater than 0. But then out of nowhere, why do we have to put this one? Okay, so let me, I'm not sure kung it's in the next slide. Yeah, not that one. Okay, so anong sagot bakit meron ito? It's because, let me just go back. Nasa slide natin kanina. Discard ko lang yung annotations ko. Yeah, it's somewhere at the start. The reason why we have to put that greater than 0 or 0 less than the absolute value is because of one of our preliminaries, this one. Okay? The value of A may or may not be in the domain of F. Okay? When we talk of limits, we are really not referring to A exactly. We just want to observe the behavior as X approaches A. Kumbaga, hindi natin kailangan yung x equal to A. Kailangan lang natin ay yung mga values that are near A. And that is being taken care of that greater than 0. This part greater than 0, we mean that we really don't need x equal to A. Let me show it here again. Di ba para naman ito'y maging 0, para ang absolute value ng x minus A ay maging 0, dapat yung x ay equal to A. However, when we talk of limits, we really don't need x equal to A. We just need the values of x that are near A, but then not necessarily at A. So that's why it's taken care of this by this greater than 0. We only need values of x that are close to A, but then not necessarily at A. Because the only way for this absolute value of x minus A to be equal to 0, again, the only way for this to be equal to 0 is when x is equal to A. So that's why we are removing that part, x equal to A, and that is taken care of this greater than 0 here. Okay, so thank you again, Mark. We are trying to close the distance to 0. Okay. What should be the max values of epsilon and delta? Actually, there is no max value for epsilon and delta. Okay, but then for delta there will be, as you will see in a short while for the computation in the example, for delta there will be some sort of a maximum distance because as you will see mamaya sa computation natin, this delta is dependent on epsilon. Okay, but then for epsilon, wala talaga siyang maximum distance, but then we do prefer relatively small values for epsilon. Dahil kasi ang gusto kasi ninyo ay behavior of the function as x approaches A. Siyempre, ang pipiliin yung distances for epsilon should be relatively small. Going back here, ayun nyo naman siyempre piliin yung epsilon yung sobrang laki. Kasi pag sobrang laki naman yung pipiliin yung epsilon, the problem is it will not really give kumbaga hindi siya nagzi-zero in dun sa kailangan yung part. Kumbaga ang kailangan nyo kasing part are this part that are near L. Diba? Wait, let me just change the color. Ang gusto kasi natin sa limit, dito yung mga parts that are near L. So as much as possible, you want this epsilon to be relatively small. Okay? Relatively small. Ayun siya sobrang laki. Kasi pag pinag-claim nyo na sobrang laki ng epsilon ninyo, sobrang laki din ng part ng graph yung inyong kukunin. And when you talk of a large part of the graph, malayo siya doon sa gusto nating part. And in this case, ang gusto nating part ay ito, yung malimit kay L, yung mga function values, and correspondingly, yung mga x's natin ay malapit kay A. Relatively. Para po palang approximation. Yep, you can think of that as somewhat an approximation. And definitely, if you're going to go to that application of calculus going to approximation theory, you'll encounter more of epsilon and delta. Okay? Epsilon and delta are also used for approximations. Because again, the problem is, when you say small, it's very relative. Di ba? Alam naman natin yung sa math. That's one of the undefined terms mathematically. What do we mean by small? How small is small? How close is close? And somehow, when we say epsilon delta being relatively small, yun yung sinasabi ko nga relatively small. We are not really saying this is small, but then relatively, compared to a larger value, this one is small enough. So hindi necessary na malapit ang value 0, but to A, hindi po, yung distance po ay dapat malapit sa 0. the distances should be near 0 so that the values of x will be near a. Tama, di ba? Yung distance po ay para, balik lang tayo doon. Okay? Baka nalito tayo. Ito po ay distance. The distance of x from a is greater than 0. Okay? Hindi po natin sinasabing values near 0. Yung pong 0 that represents distance. Okay? So balik lang tayo sa illustration na ito. Values of x po natin dapat ay malapit kay a. So dapat ang distance ni x from a should be near 0. Yun yung gusto nating mangyari dito. Okay? Not necessarily po the values going at 0, but then the distances are near 0. Okay? Sige. Okay. So again, let me go back. Ano yung emphasize ko rito? Saan ang galing itong absolute value of x minus a? Sorry for reading this as greater than. Dahil kasi diba, if you are going to read this, absolute value of x minus a is greater than 0. Tama, no? This one on the right is the one that is greater than 0. But then I know what you are seeing is less than. But then it should be read as the absolute value of x minus a is greater than 0. This part takes care of that part that we really don't need the x equal to a. What we need are the behaviors when the x's are very near a. Sabi nga dito ni Mark, look, para siyang approximation niya. It looks like approximation. To look at the behavior at x equal to a, you want the points that are very near a. But then once again, we are just simply talking here of distances. If the distance of x from a is less than delta, greater than 0, then the distance of the function values from L is less than epsilon. Okay? So, let us go back now. Okay. So, ito po yung gusto talaga nating mangyari. For every epsilon, again, the epsilon in a while will bound the distance of the function value from L. For this epsilon, we need to find a corresponding delta. Ano itong mga epsilon and delta? The epsilon and the delta represents distances, such that if we choose an x that is within a distance delta from A, or in a more mathematical way of writing that, the absolute value of x minus a greater than 0 less than delta, again, this should be read as the distance of x from A is less than delta. But then due to the study of, as we've mentioned, when we're talking of limits, hindi natin kailangan talaga yung x equal to a, we put this part greater than 0, meaning that we really don't need exactly x equal to a. We are more curious of the excess of what will happen if the x's are near a. Okay, so if x is within delta distance from a, nasa na yun? Then the corresponding function value, parang nawawala, sorry po, no, nagluluko yung aking view. The corresponding function value will be of distance epsilon from L. Okay, so yun yung gusto natin sabihin dito. For every epsilon, we need to get a corresponding delta, such that if x is within delta distance from A, then the corresponding function value will be of epsilon distance from L. Okay? And that is the epsilon delta definition of limit of a function. Taken as a whole, it seems confusing. Okay? But then really what we're trying to do with this definition is to capture that idea of approaching. Ano bang ibig sabihin natin pinag-a-approach? And when we talk of approaching, we are talking of being close and then of distances. But then again, the question is, mathematically, how can we capture that concept of closeness? And one attempt to do that is to use relatively small distances, epsilon and delta. Because again, mathematically, the concept of smallness being near is really relative. But then we can have a way of going over that. Okay? And it's captured by this epsilon delta definition of a limit. Okay? Mamaya ko sagutin nyo, in between po ba ng x minus a? Ang tanong ni Mark, in between po ba ang absolute value ng 0 and delta? Yes, the distance of x from a should be between 0 and delta. That is one way also of reading this. The distance of x from a should be between 0 and delta. Delta represents the maximum distance. And then 0 is put here because we really don't need x equal to a. Okay? We need the values of x that are near A, not necessarily x equal to A. Okay? So thank you, Mark, for that. Wait.